All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a place nestled on the northern coast of South America. It's a country that honestly flies completely under the radar in most global news, yet it holds some of the absolute deepest complexities and most remarkable world records of any nation on Earth. It's the smallest country in South America, but as we're going to see, its history and its cultural makeup are just massive.
And this brings us right to a central mystery. It's a complete paradox. How do you have a pristine nation, endowed with unparalleled ecological wealth, literally a world record for forest coverage, and an incredibly peaceful coexistence of 15 different ethnic groups? Yet its history over the last several decades has been marked by severe economic collapse, military coups, and civil conflict. How do these two extremes exist in the exact same place?
So to unpack this puzzle, here is a roadmap for today. First, we'll look at an unlikely melting pot. Then, sugar, slavery, and resistance. Next up, abolition and new arrivals, followed by independence and turmoil. And finally, we'll wrap up with the modern crossroads. Okay, let's jump straight into part one, an unlikely melting pot, the first inhabitants.
Way before any European ships showed up on the horizon, this territory had a really intense dynamic of its own. For millennia, the land was inhabited by foraging and fishing tribes. By the time the Europeans did arrive, two main groups dominated the landscape. On one hand, you had the Arawaks. They had these peaceful, semi-permanent riverside settlements focused on agriculture and fishing. But on the other hand, you had the Caribs, and they were aggressive expeditionary clans, moving upriver in war canoes and relentlessly invading Arawak territory. They effectively pushed the Arawaks into the swampier, much less accessible habitats. But here's the interesting part. Despite this violent conquest, over time, intermarriages and alliances were actually established. They created composite villages that laid the very first layers of Suriname's incredibly complex demographic foundation.
Moving right along to Section 2, sugar, slavery, and resistance, the colonial era. So the early colonial period? Total mess. It was a literal tug of war between European powers. In 1630, the Dutch captured the territory from the Spanish. But a massive shift happened in 1650 when the English introduced African slavery to the region. They quickly realized the unforgiving equatorial jungle environment was just too harsh for white laborers, and the indigenous people had either died from European diseases or fled deep into the interior. Eventually, after a whole lot of fighting, the 1667 Treaty of Breda firmly secured Dutch control. Get this, they literally traded their claims on New Amsterdam, which you might know today as New York, to keep Suriname. Under Dutch rule, Suriname became a massive hub for sugar production, fueled entirely by the brutal enslavement of West Africans. Now, here is where the story takes a truly fascinating turn. The sheer harshness of that Dutch plantation system directly birthed one of the most resilient societies in the world. Enslaved Africans fiercely resisted their captors by escaping deep into the impenetrable rainforest. These escapees, who became known as Maroons, founded completely autonomous communities. They essentially became warlords and defenders of their own freedom. Because they were so perfectly isolated in the deep interior, they managed to preserve their West African languages, religious ceremonies, and cultural traditions for over 250 years. They created the largest, most intact Maroon society in the Americas.
Which brings us to Section 3, Abolition and New Arrivals, a demographic shift.
So, 1863 rolls around, and the Dutch finally abolish slavery. Naturally, the formerly enslaved black population abandoned the sugar estates, seeking true independence and moving to the cities or the bushland. But the plantation economy still desperately needed cheap labor, so the colonial rulers made a massive pivot. They transitioned away from importing enslaved humans from Angola and Ghana and started relying on indentured workers. These new laborers were brought in on very strict 5-year agricultural contracts to basically replace the massive loss of the workforce.
And this pivot, it completely transformed the country's DNA. To fill those contracts, the Dutch brought in laborers from India, from Java in modern-day Indonesia, and from China. Throw in Portuguese laborers, the existing European colonizers, the autonomous Maroons, the Creole population, and the original indigenous peoples, and wow, you suddenly have over 15 distinct ethnic groups sharing this relatively small South American territory. What is truly remarkable, though, is that despite the colonial design, all these groups successfully mingled into a society characterized by its sheer lack of ethnic conflict. Hindus, Muslims, and Christians literally built their temples, mosques, and churches side by side, creating an incredible culture of tolerance. Now you might be wondering, how on earth did all these different people talk to each other? Well, while Dutch remained the official language of the government and schools, the streets spoke entirely differently.
This brings us to Suriname. Originally, it was a Creole language, which is a natural language that develops from mixing different languages together, spoken by the Afro-Syriodis population. But it rapidly evolved into the great equalizer. It became the go-to language of commerce, transport, and daily life across all ethnic lines. It's just a perfect symbol of how the people of Suriname forged a shared identity out of a highly fractured colonial past.
Let's turn the page to Section 4, Independence and Turmoil, a Dream Deferred.
The road to modernity was, unfortunately, incredibly rocky. In 1975, Suriname officially gained independence from the Netherlands, and there was massive optimism at first. But the economy was still heavily reliant on Dutch aid and bauxite mining, and the transition was chaotic. The new government lacked experienced personnel, and many skilled citizens packed up and emigrated to the Netherlands. This instability basically rolled out the red carpet for 1980 when a group of military officers led by Daisy Bouterse executed a coup d'etat. Things spiraled fast. What followed was severe political factionalism. In 1982, opposition leaders were killed in the infamous December murders, and by 1986, the country was totally plunged into the Suriname's interior war, a violent civil conflict that raged on for years.
300%. Let that number sink in for a second. That was the staggering inflation rate Suriname hit in 1983. During the Civil War and under military rule, the economy just completely collapsed. Foreign investment totally dried up, development aid from the Netherlands was severed, and the state essentially lost all control of its finances. It was an economic depression of epic proportions.
During this military rule, the Bouterse regime faced a cascading series of crises. The civil service was completely paralyzed, state companies went bankrupt, and massive foreign debt piled up. To try and get around global isolation and total financial ruin, elements of the regime became entangled with international narco-trafficking. Endemic corruption and illicit land exchanges further hollowed out whatever resources the state had left, leaving the everyday civilian population holding the bag and dealing with the heavy consequences of a broken economy.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, the modern crossroads, nature versus economy.
Now, despite all that political and economic chaos we just talked about, here is a stat that will absolutely blow your mind. Suriname still retains 93% pristine rainforest coverage. That is an absolute world record. It is the jewel of the Guyana Shield, a massive geological formation in South America that's a globally recognized biodiversity hotspot. We're talking millions of hectares of untouched ecosystems, totally unique endemic species, and massive freshwater reserves.
But, as you might guess, that 93% is in serious danger right now. Because of those historical economic failures, there is a really desperate push for revenue. We're seeing a huge surge in hydraulic gold mining, which completely poisons the water systems. There's a renewed push by international companies from massive deforestation just to plant oil palm and sugarcane. Throw in industrial agriculture and overfishing, and you literally have a perfect storm. Plus, decrepit infrastructure severely limits the government's ability to actually police and mitigate these environmental threats, which puts the traditional maroon and indigenous communities of the interior at incredibly great risk.
So the modern Surinamese economy presents a really difficult dilemma. The formal sector relies incredibly heavily on extractive industries, bauxite, gold, and potentially oil. Meanwhile, there's a massive informal sector that often operates totally outside of government regulation and taxation. The huge challenge for Suriname today is figuring out how to shift from an economy that historically exploits the land for quick cash to one that sustainably manages its rich natural resources without destroying its greatest asset, the forest itself.
And that leaves us with this final provocative thought. We've seen how 15 distinct ethnic groups actually forged a peaceful coexistence out of the horrific trauma of colonization and slavery. We've seen how political instability and economic collapse have repeatedly pushed the nation right to the brink. So, as the world increasingly looks to places like Suriname to help combat global climate change, the massive question remains: can this incredible, culturally rich, and ecologically vital nation finally stabilize its politics and economy before its pristine nature is lost forever? It's a huge paradox that continues to unfold, and it is definitely a story worth watching. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep your curiosity alive.